All right. Hello, everyone. Thank you all so much for joining us. This is Left Bank Books, welcomes award-winning journalist, professional speaker, and the author of We Need to Talk, Celeste Headlee, who will discuss her highly anticipated new book, Speaking of Race. Headlee tonight will be in conversation with the senior editor for Race and Justice Unit at New York Public Radio, Jamie Floyd. Left Bank Books is St. Louis's oldest independent bookstore. We would like to thank all of our supporters, the supporters of Celeste and Jamie, and everyone for their outpouring of love for our bookstore. We offer in-store shopping, curbside pickup, and delivery to anywhere in the country, anywhere in the world even. We are happy to be able to bring our event series virtual. We believe that events are a way to expand your mind and bring in new thoughts to make the world a better place. We hope that you enjoyed this event, and we hope that you support Left Bank Books by purchasing a copy for you or for all of your friends at left-bank.com. Purchasing a copy of the book from Left Bank Books allows us to keep our bookstore and staff operating, and it allows us to continue bringing in incredible authors for you. So thank you all so much for your support. I am Shane Mullen. I'm the events coordinator for Left Bank Books. I help produce our hundreds of author events each year with a fantastic team here in St. Louis. Tonight, we will be taking questions from you, the audience, at the end of the event, so you can type your questions as a comment, and you can do that at any point in time throughout the event as it comes to your mind. And be sure to follow Left Bank Books on Facebook and YouTube to be notified about all of our fantastic virtual events. And now, about tonight's book. Speaking of race, why everybody needs to talk about racism and how to do it. This is a Boston Globe most anticipated fall book. In this urgently needed guide, the PBS host, award-winning journalist, and author of We Need to Talk teaches us how to have productive conversations about race, offering insights, advice, and support. A self-described light-skinned Black Jew, Celeste Headlee has been forced to speak about race, including having to defend or define her own since childhood. In her career as a journalist for public media, she's made it a priority to talk about race proactively. She's discovered, however, that those exchanges have rarely been productive. While many people say they want to talk about race, the reality is they want to talk about race with people who agree with them. The subject makes us uncomfortable. It's often not considered polite or appropriate. To avoid these painful discussions, we stay in our bubbles, reinforcing our own sense of righteousness as well as our division. Yet we gain nothing by not engaging with those we disagree with. Empathy does not develop in a vacuum, and racism won't just fade away. If we are to effect meaningful change as a society, Headlee argues, we have to be able to talk about what that change looks like without fear of losing friends and jobs or being ostracized. In Speaking of Race, Headlee draws from her experience as a journalist and the latest research on bias, communication, and neuroscience to provide practical advice and insight for talking about race that will facilitate better conversations that can actually bring us closer together. This is the book for people who have tried to debate and educate and argue and got nowhere. It is the book for those who have stopped talking to a neighbor or dread Thanksgiving dinner. It is an essential and timely book for all of us. Angela Duckworth, the founder and CEO of Character Lab and New York Times bestselling author of Grit, says, Celeste Headlee says we cannot go around, over, or under the subject of race in this country. We must go through it. And the way forward is to have conversations. This is simply the best book I've read on how to have those conversations. Unflinchingly honest, exceptionally well-reasoned and researched, there is so much to admire about Speaking of Race. But my very favorite element is the conversations in each chapter, excerpts from Celeste's interviews in which you can glimpse the perspective-changing power of dialogue. And now, about tonight's speakers. Celeste Headlee is an award-winning journalist, professional speaker, and the author of We Need to Talk, How to Have Conversations That Matter, and Do Nothing, How to Break Away from Overworking, Overdoing, and Underliving. An expert in conversation, human nature, Reclaiming our common humanity and finding well-being, Celeste frequently provides insight on what is good for all humans and what is bad for us, focusing on the best research in neuro and social science to increase understanding of how we relate to one another and can work together in beneficial ways in our workplaces, neighborhoods, communities, and homes. She is a regular guest host on NPR and American Public Media, and a highly sought consultant, advising companies around the world on conversations about race, diversity, and inclusion. Her TEDx talk, Sharing 10 Ways to Have a Better Conversation, has over 23 million total views. And she serves as an advisory board member for procon.org and the Listen First Project. Celeste is the recipient of the 2019 Media Changemaker Award. She is the proud granddaughter of composer William Grant Still, the Dean of African American Composers. And tonight, she will be in conversation with Jamie Floyd. Jamie is the senior editor for Race and Justice Unit at New York Public Radio. She is also the legal editor in the WNYC newsroom. You can follow her on Twitter and Instagram at Jamie Floyd. Jamie was born and raised in New York City and grew up listening to WNYC. She has been a news junkie ever since childhood when she delivered newscasts for her grandmother from the dining room table. She went on to serve as editor-in-chief of her high school newspaper, ombudsperson for the college newspaper, and to DJ for WHRW, the campus radio station at Binghamton University, SUNY, at Berkeley Law School. At Berkeley Law School, she served as an associate editor of the California Law Review, where she also published. In a journalism career that spans 2 decades, Jamie has worked on everything from breaking news to exclusives to long-form investigations. Jamie has had the opportunity to interview countless newsmakers, including Hillary Clinton, Donald Trump, and former Illinois Governor Rod Blagojevich, cited by the New York Times for her barrage of hard-hitting questions. Jamie still considers her interview with Myrlie Evers Williams, widow of slain civil rights leader Medgar Evers, to be her most meaningful. Until September 2020, she served as the weekday host of All Things Considered. And now, without further ado, if you'd please all help me in welcoming our guests for the evening, Celeste Headlee and Jamie Floyd for Left Bank Books. Help me give them a giant round of applause. Hello.
Hello. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you. I'm so excited for this conversation. I know that a lot of people, we've had so many phone calls today, so I'm really excited to have you here.
Well, thank you so much, Shane.
Yes, and support independent bookstores, everyone who is here. Buy your books, even if they're not mine. Buy them at an independent bookstore, please. Hello.
Lots of books. Lots of copies of Celeste's book and lots of others. And Shane, thank you so much for that wonderful introduction, and to Left Bank Books for having us for this really important conversation. And Shane, we're going to be taking questions, right?
Yes, at the end of the event. So
terrific. So please send your questions in, and Shane will curate them, and we will take them along the way and hold most of them to the end. If there's something really pressing and pertinent, we'll take it in the midst of the conversation, because Celeste and I are old friends, so this is going to be pretty fluid, even though it's a conversation about race. We talk about that all the time, Celeste and myself, and we're really happy to welcome Left Bank Books and this community into what is a critically important conversation. And then Shane will keep us apprised of your questions as we go. And Celeste, thank you so much for inviting me to join you in this talk.
Of course. Who better?
So the book is, of course, called Speaking of Race, and I want to congratulate you, Celeste, on yet another tour de force. But this time I want to do exactly what you're asking us to do, talk about race. And I want to begin with the paragraph that, one of the many, but a particular one I highlighted for you to ask you to read it, one of the ones that opens your book. I think it's on the second page of the book. If you wouldn't mind reading a few short lines that I asked you to read for the audience.
Sure. I have thought about bias and race nearly every day of my life, and I've come to realize that the majority of people believe they are not biased, that they're mostly fair and just in their dealings with others. I've also come to understand how wrong that assumption is, how our understanding of bias is hampered because of our insistence that the problem lies in other people's attitudes and not our own.
Other people's attitudes and not our own. Thank you, Celeste. So let me begin then this conversation tonight by asking you two questions right off that first paragraph. You say that you've thought about bias and race nearly every day of your life. And as Shane said in the intro, and as you write elsewhere in the book, you are a self-described, quote, light-skinned Black Jew. Is that why you've been forced to think about and speak about race every day of your life since childhood?
Yeah, I mean, it's one of them. I mean, I can't tell you how many times I've been asked, what are you? When you're racially nondescript, and I imagine this is probably true of you as well, Jamie, where people aren't quite sure what your background is, and for some reason they need to find out. They need to categorize you. And the other reason is that my grandfather is an icon of Black history, right? So I'm constantly going to events and representing him because he died in 1978. And I'm not what people expect when they meet the granddaughter of one of the most famous African Americans in American history, right? So I'm constantly, my whole life I've been asked what I am, to sort of explain myself and how I describe myself, and that's difficult. I mean, I don't think we've talked enough about the experience of the mixed race people. Not that it's more important in any way, shape, or form than anybody else's. It's just a story that hasn't been fully delved into and talked about, because sometimes, especially when me and Colin Powell, when you don't necessarily fully fit into another category. And, sometimes that's because of your habits, right? Like there's all these rules for Black people that you're not supposed to go camping, or like ABBA. So like if you don't fit into the categories perfectly well, you get questioned. And so, yeah, I've been questioned most of my life.
Right. And you participated for a time, and I'm going to re-up this project, but in something I called the Other Box Project. And it goes back to the original census, which had very few categories, what was then the category of American Indian, then what was then Negro, and then white or Caucasian then, and everybody else.
Yep.
And we would have been, well, back
we
then
are other.
It was the one drop rule. So I guess we would have been in the Negro category, right?
Yeah.
But then over time, the categories in the census changed. And the fastest growing category now, Celeste, as you know, better than anyone, or as well as anyone, is the multiracial category. So say more about why, and it is now an option. Checking more than one box is an option. So say why you think we should be talking more about multiracial identity, or however people want to call it. We all have our labels. Different people choose different things. But why do you think exploring that part of our history is important? Because it does go back to the beginning, right? Multiracial or biracial or whatever we want to call it, race being a construct. Why do you think we should be talking more about that?
I mean, first of all, almost all of us are multiracial. Do you remember when we found out that Michelle Obama had white people in her family tree and everybody who's not Black flipped out, right? And everybody was so surprised that this dark-skinned woman had white people in their family tree, except for Black people, of course, because slavery was a thing that went on for hundreds of years. And guess what happened when people were slaves in an abusive system? So, That's the one thing, is that there is no such race is a fiction, which means this idea that there's such a thing as being only one breed is also a fiction. Like, we're all multiracial. And I think that's wonderful in so many ways. We all get to define our own identity, right? It means, because race is a fiction, it means that what race is to me is who I am, and my own culture and my own background and the traditions that we had growing up. And I actually think that's a wonderful thing, but it does mean that we need to talk a little bit more about culture and identity, not as a binary, but as a spectrum. I think it's so wonderful that we've begun to talk about sexuality and gender as a spectrum and understand it in the way that biologists have understood it for a very, very long time. But we also need to bring that same sensibility to bear on race and understand it as a spectrum that, in fact, you do kind of move in and out, because it's about who you are and what you love and what you think of yourself and your own family.
Why, though, Celeste? Ed Ball wrote that wonderful book called Slaves in the Family, when he discovered that his white Christian family actually owned a lot of slaves a couple of generations back. Why aren't these ties that bind? Why does this cause so much division in our country rather than bring us together as a culture and as a society?
Because it became part of the capitalist system, right? I mean, slavery, this is something that the historian Ibram Kendi has documented multiple times over, and Isabel Wilkerson and other fantastic historians, that slavery really gained a foothold and became widespread globally, as opposed to like sort of a local thing that you saw in different areas around the world, because you got chattel slavery because that was the way to make an economy boom. Right? Like, the only way you got those big plantation houses and those giant estates in the South is because they weren't paying their laborers. So once you get economic systems involved in this, then those economic systems have to somehow justify them. And in order to justify them, they brought to bear pretty much every societal pressure. They brought to bear political pressure. They brought to bear economic pressure. They brought to bear religious pressure, where they could say, look, here in the Bible. They even had a whole slew of scientists who for hundreds of years were trying to prove there was some biological basis to prove that Black people or Asians were inferior to the white race, that pretty much everyone was inferior to the white race. That's all been debunked. There is no scientific evidence of that, because there's no such thing as biological race. But of course, they had to justify it. It's interesting when we talk about how to convince people to stop being biased and prejudiced. One of the most effective ways to do that is by using their cognitive dissonance. So people believe they are not racist. Pretty much everybody, right? That was one of the things I talk about in the book. Like, even David Duke, if you ask him, says he's not racist. Okay? So this is what they believe about themselves, that they're essentially fair, not racist people, upstanding, honorable people. And then they do something that's awful and racist and unfair, and somebody points it out and says, hey, that's racist. And they have a choice at this point, because it creates this cognitive dissonance. These two things don't match. And cognitive dissonance is extremely uncomfortable for the human brain. It's a kind of pain. It's a kind of psychic pain. And we have to relieve it. And so you can either say, I did something that's biased. I need to change my ways and not do that again. Or you can say, that wasn't racist. That was justified. I was just making a joke. You took it the wrong way. And then that still allows you to maintain that image of yourself. And so for a very long time, we have chosen that, the greater society has chosen that second way around. And even during slavery, that's what they chose. No. Slaves like to be slaves. They're simple people. Listen, they're singing in the fields, right? That's how they relieved that cognitive dissonance.
And I do want to bring it back to your book, and even that paragraph that I had you read, and the second part about this bias and this dissonance, and you use David Duke as an example, as sort of a, a stark example of what you're talking about, the neo-Nazi, the former Grand Wizard of the KKK, because you're asking us to examine our biases, even those of us who clearly aren't on that order of bias, but asking all of us to examine our biases. And you say, Celeste, that all of us have them, all of us. And you're talking not just about racism, but also classism, sexism, looksism, you write about, that we just walk around with these biases without even realizing we have them. But that race, you say, is the hardest one, perhaps, in this society for us to talk about.
Yeah, I mean, we only now are getting to the point where the United States has been a slave-free country for longer than it was a slave country. Mm-hmm. Only now. So that's how long. I mean, they brought slaves to the United States. That wasn't the United States at that point. They brought states to this nation before the settlers landed on Plymouth Rock. So this is really ingrained. And again, it was enshrined in our policies, in our politics, in our schools.
Even in our Constitution.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It is everywhere. And again, that was so that they could justify something that was clearly immoral and wrong. And it always makes me smirk a little bit when people say, yeah, but at the time, everybody thought that was okay. Nope. That is not correct. That is 100% not correct. Other countries, including Britain, had outlawed slavery long before the United States did. And that was after a long period of protest by their own citizens. So people had known for quite some time that it was wrong.
And there were always people here who protested slavery. There were enslavement. There were always abolitionists here, and even white people here.
Oh, absolutely,
knew it was wrong and protested.
Lots of them. Yeah. Lots of them.
Not everyone. Please.
And come on. The other thing is that you're gonna beat and slaughter a child, which happened all the time. You're gonna rip a child from the arms of its mother, and you're gonna tell me they didn't realize that was wrong? I mean, come on. Of course they did. But they had all these systems telling them, no, it's okay. You're right. From all areas. I'm not excusing anybody. I'm just saying that the entire system was set up to make people feel okay with that and justify it. Mm-hmm. So the thing of it is, and one of the stories that I include in the book to sort of explain how this bias lives in all of us. I mean, first of all, we know that there are gay people who are homophobic. We know that. Some of the most virulent homophobes it ends up that they're gay or queer in some way. We know there are women who are sexist. We know that. And there are plenty of people of color who are racist. But I include a little bit of the baby doll test from the psychologist, the Clarks, that was used as the foundation for the Brown v. Board of Education case before the Supreme Court, which you as a lawyer, I don't need to tell you anything about. But in any case, they brought all these young black kids in, and they showed them two dolls. One of the dolls was white. They were identical in every way, except one was white and one was black. And they would ask them questions about the doll. Which one is pretty? The white one. Which one is good? The white one. Which one is smart? The white one. And then they'd ask them, which one looks like you? And they would point to the black doll. And one of the kids said, which one looks most like you? And he points to the black doll and he says, that one's a nigger like me. And my question in the book is, so is that kid racist? And yes, he is racist. He's making assumptions based on race. Now, in this case, he's a victim of racism rather than a perpetrator. So there's no moral equivalency here, but he is racist. And it's these things that live inside of us that we have to be honest about, that we have to talk about and dig them out of there, because otherwise we won't be free of this.
It's a sickness.
Yeah, absolutely. It described as a smog that we're breathing in every day. right? If it's in the air, how do you not breathe it? Beverly Daniel Tatum talks about it that way, that it's smog. And I think that's a great way to think about it.
Right. And that's why your subtitle is why everybody needs to talk about racism. But really, Celeste, everybody?
Yeah.
I mean, aren't there some folks who really don't need to reckon
Nope.
with this as much as the other folks like us?
No, everybody does. Now, I mean, you and I both know that in communities of color and between friends of color, we talk about racism all the time. We always do, right? It's a top topic of conversation all the time. And I'm not saying that a Black person or a Latinx person or a person of color who is exhausted at this point has to go out there and be the one evangelizing. In fact, a lot of this book is focused on trying to convince white people that this is their work, right? That they have the most, and by that I mean they have the most power to affect change. But everyone needs to be talking about it. And we need to be talking about it with people who disagree. It's good for us cognitively. It's good for us as a nation. And frankly, having a mutually respectful conversation, even with someone you don't like, even with someone you disagree with, helps to create those empathic bonds that over time will affect change.
I want to get very much to this point about disagreement and talking sort of beyond the table of one's friends of mutual agreement, which is what we all like to do.
Yeah.
In just a moment, because you spend so much, that's the real point of this book, right?
Yeah.
But I just want to do a quick follow on what I just asked you, which was, do we really all have to be having these conversations? And you went in one direction, which was, I totally understand why those of us who are having these conversations all the time might be tired. But I want to ask you a slightly different question, which is, white people might not feel they need to have these conversations. It's not really their problem.
Yeah. There's this great book called Dying of Whiteness that gathers up to the point that book was published, at least, the cost, not just in dollars, but to health of the white supremacist system we live in. You know, a lot of times when people hear, you know, people of color complaining about white supremacy, they think that's a thing that affects white people of color. But it also affects you. And it's not great. I mean, all those things I was talking about, the resolving your cognitive dissonance by choosing the lower way, that's not actually good for your psyche. To suppress those feelings of possibly obligation, to suppress those bad feelings, like this whole push to not, okay, first of all, no one is teaching critical race theory in elementary schools, but this effort, it's not happening. But this effort to suppress the teaching of honest history, that's not good for you. It's not good for your children. It's not good for anybody, and it has real effects. You know, human beings are such that the difficulties we have cognitively and neurologically and emotionally and psychologically, they have real physiological effects on our body. So if you are looking around the country and thinking to yourself, oh, if only we could go back to normal, A, it's never going to happen. But B, normal wasn't good for you either. So many people, white people, have been manipulated in order to sustain the elite class of our country by being told that at least they're on a higher level than the people of color. That is the lie that has been told to white people, especially middle-income and low-income white people, for a very long time. And even though it's not being said explicitly now, the way that it was in the past, that it is still the underlying message. And so, of course, there is psychic terror at the thought that you're losing the one thing that you had. But instead, we can be joining together and understanding that this is all just designed to take from us and feed everything up to this higher elite class. And we are not each other's enemy. Our enemy is this system that is preventing us from thriving and from actually making a good living off of the labor that we do. So yeah, do white people need to be talking about? That's one reason. It's good for them. The other reason is that white people have the most power to change things. I truly believe, and when you poll people, most people at this point say that things are harder for black people than they are for white people. Most people acknowledge that. Most people think that everyone in this country should have the right to have the same opportunities, the same education, the feeling of being safe.
Mm-hmm.
And white people can actually do it. The ability of people of color to change the system is limited. But the power of white people, and especially white men, I feel like this would be exciting to me if I were one of you. You could actually change this. You could end this. This could be your moment to change history. So yeah, you should be talking about this. Grab this opportunity with both hands.
And grab this book. I just want to make another little plug in the middle of the conversation. You can grab the book at Left Bank Books. And the other book you mentioned, Celeste, there, oh my goodness, so well done. And the other book you mentioned, Celeste, is Dying of Whiteness. And it was not that long ago, actually. It was 2019. So yeah. The research, he hasn't dropped another edition of it yet, but the research in there is pretty current.
Very current. Jonathan Metzi, I think?
Metzel, right. And Metzel, I didn't just know that. I did look it up while we were talking, but I remember the book well. And you're right. He's arguing that it's essentially a sickness that is eating us alive and hurting our culture and hurting our health, and all the energy that we're expounding on this, we could be putting toward, as you're saying, making a better culture and society. What I love about the fact that you mentioned that book and all of the other research and authors that you've mentioned is that all of your works, including this one, are so well researched, and you've done thousands of interviews in the course of your journalism career, as well as in the course of your research. And I wonder what all of that has taught you about these hard conversations. How has that informed what you know about what we can bring to the table when we try to have conversations around race and racism? What works and what doesn't?
I'll tell you, Jamie, the first thing that comes to mind is that people get defensive really quickly. Really quickly. And It's mostly white people, but it's not just white people. Right? I remember this is for when I was at WNYC, and I was moderating a panel at the Harlem Museum on James Baldwin. And they had 3 academics there, really distinguished black men who all study Baldwin. And at one point, one of them started explaining, I'm not going to name check him. He started talking about Barack Obama as a black man. And because we were talking about racial identity, I said, well, also half white. And he turned to the audience and was like, should we explain this to her? And I was like, well, I'm mixed race, so I feel like you don't need to explain anything to me. And he says, oh, I didn't even know. You dogged me. You dogged me. And I was like, you dogged yourself, brother. Ask. Don't make assumptions. And he got defensive, of course. Right? So we are so sensitive to any even hint that we might be biased, that we might be racist in any way, that it turns to defensiveness like that. And the thing I want to point out... Or
that we might not know something.
Exactly. Which, kind of amounts to the same thing in a way, right? If you don't know something, that can easily end up being a horrible, catastrophic mistake at which you get labeled as racist. And for some reason, racist has become the worst thing you can be called. In fact, there's a lot, I don't know if it's a majority, I can't remember, but the large number of white people who feel that being called racist is as bad as being called the N-word to a black person. It is not. Let me just put that out there. So this is what I have learned as how quickly these conversations can go bad, on a dime. And so it means we all have to be a little more intentional. I don't mean careful. I just mean intentional and present when we're having these conversations, and aware of where are we, who's listening. Are we in public? Are we one-on-one? What kind of day am I having? Do I have the patience for this? What kind of day are they having? Right? Like, this is one of the toughest conversations that you can have. Set yourself up for success. And it's okay to put a pin in it. If somebody utters something like a microaggression, it's okay to say, whoa, that's inappropriate. Let's find a time to talk about that. It is okay to come back to it if it's not the right time.
And is that, I interrupted you to talk about ignorance for a moment, but you were going to say, I want to be sure to say, was that what you were about to say, to be intentional about it, to check yourself and make sure it's the right moment to have that kind of conversation?
Yeah, absolutely. You just need to be aware, because not only, we have to remember that not only can the other person very quickly and suddenly become defensive, we can very quickly and suddenly become defensive. And so I put exercises in the book to try to prepare you for that feeling, to try to figure out how to diffuse it. Because, of course, here's an interesting thing from conversational research. More than 4 out of 5 people say that a past relationship has failed because of poor communication. But fewer than 1 in 5 say it was their fault.
4 out of 5 dentists surveyed.
So do that math. We're very wrong about how often it's our fault.
There's no
We're
way.
Very wrong about that. Right. No way that matches.
I love what you're saying about, first of all, the exercises in this book are fabulous. And they're great for workplaces, for educational institutions, for secondary, for high schools or colleges or graduate schools or families. I mean, anybody can use these exercises. But this part about checking yourself, I mean, when somebody does something that offends you or might offend you or might not be wrong, we tend to just go for, either you back off right away and that's your style, and then you feel badly for 3 days, 5 days, you're steaming, or you always go for the confrontation. And there's a middle ground. Let me go and check with Celeste and see whether this is something I should respond to, or let me just sit down here for a minute and have a coffee or a tea before I say something. So that it's, self-awareness is what you're talking about. That's brilliant. It's brilliant. And the exercise,
being present with it.
But you're also right that this is not a book, you write, that is about the same kind of, you say, ineffectual discussions of race that so many of us have had in the past. And then I wanted to say to Celeste, but now I can because you're right here, what are you talking about? What are those conversations that you think we've been having the wrong way, Celeste?
Go on Twitter and search for "you're a racist" and you will find all of those conversations, right? It's all these conversations that are meant to prove that someone is racist, or prove that someone else is a libtard and is overly woke, the woke mob, and that they're being too sensitive, right? It's anytime you go into one of these conversations proving that you did nothing wrong and that they're wrong, you've lost. You have lost, because none of those things are going to happen. There is just no evidence that over the course of a conversation you can change someone's mind, educate them, or prove them wrong to themselves. So you're just ending up shouting out arguments at one another, pleasing yourself with what it is that you're saying, and not listening to one another at all. You're just wasting your breath. Those are the kind of conversations about race that we have. And they're doing nothing. I mean, look, I don't even have to tell you they're doing nothing. If they were working, we wouldn't be here.
Right. You said something in the book about debate versus conversation.
Yeah, and in a debate, you're marshaling your arguments. You're a lawyer preparing to argue your case. You're trying to prove a point, and so you're marshaling your arguments instead of figuring out what it is that they're going to say. If you have a conversation in which you learn nothing from the other person, then you actually haven't had a conversation. You've just talked.
Mm-hmm. you've told the story, and I've heard you tell it a few times about the civil rights activist Zernona
Zernona?
Clayton. Yeah. And how she has this groundbreaking series of conversations. Another KKK leader, right? Calvin Craig. Um,
Yeah. There's a street
tell
named
us
after her
about
in
that.
Atlanta.
Tell us
So
about that.
Zernona is still kicking, by the way, 91 or 92 years old. She was born in Oklahoma, small town girl, and went on to become a friend of the Kings, Dr. King and his wife. And she worked with the National Urban League. She worked with the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. And she got charged with, she became the head of a program in Atlanta that was a neighborhood, overseeing a neighborhood program. And the mayor came to her and said, Zernona, I just want to warn you that one of the neighborhood captains is a grand wizard or whatever in the KKK. And she said, okay. Now, Zernona is all of like 4'11". She is a firebrand, even now. And he would come in every once in a while and sit down and give his reports to her in her office, and she would listen to him. And he started coming more frequently. And then he started coming every week. And then sometimes he'd come more than once a week. And as the months went by, he just started liking her. He liked talking to Zernona. I mean, I'm literally quoting him. He said, I just like to talk to her. And after this went on for some period of time, he denounced the KKK. And this wasn't that long after Dr. King was murdered. But he said, I want to be clear. This is not because of Dr. King's death. It's because of Zernona Clayton. Mm. And I couldn't imagine ever hating her enough to hurt her. Mm-hmm. And, you know, Zernona went on with her life. And years later, maybe even decades later, this man's daughter came to find her, track her down, and found her and started sobbing when she finally met her and said, you saved our family, you saved our lives. Like, you're the one that got our dad out of the KKK and you saved all of us. I'm so grateful to you. Mm. And it's just, for me, it's an example of a couple things. A, conversation absolutely can change people's minds. But Zernona was not trying to change his mind. She was just chatting with him, and it took a really long time. It didn't happen over one conversation. It took time.
Right. Patience.
Yep.
And also getting to know people who, again, are outside your comfort zone.
Yeah, absolutely.
Having an open heart and an open mind.
Yes. And that can create that cognitive dissonance, right? This is someone who's like, I don't hate, I think black people are inferior. Here's this black woman who I really admire and think is wonderful. These don't match.
Yeah. Yeah. That's a rather extreme example. I have to say, you know, I interviewed many, many years ago, Byron D. LeBeckwith, who, as we know, is, one of our country's most loathsome assassins. And I did not have any great breakthrough with him. It was a journalism interview, so he wasn't interested in that. But I often
he assassinated Medgar Evers, for those who don't remember.
Yes,
that,
yes. Apologies for not. And that's how I then met Murley Evers. Shane mentioned that in the introduction. But I have often wondered about, I met him far into his late life before the trial that ultimately resulted in his conviction, thankfully. But I wonder about people who might have met with him earlier in his life. Had he been, you know, met people as a young man? I mean, some people are filled with hate and you might never reach them. But I think these conversations, Celeste, that you're suggesting, I mean, we can only try. We can only try. What is the alternative?
And keep in mind that almost no one is going to be talking to these kind of people. Almost nobody is going to be talking to a neo-Nazi or a KKK member. In fact, I take very great care to tell people, do not approach a neo-Nazi. They're dangerous, right? Most of us are going to be talking to our Uncle Phil, who keeps asking every time we meet for the holidays why Black people have to make everything about race. Like, that's the person you're most likely going to be talking to. And
Right.
those are the conversations I want people to have. Even if you can only stand 5 or 10 minutes at a time, even if that's as much as you can bear, do put the 5 minutes in, because
Right.
these give us examples that even in extreme examples, change can happen. Sorry, there's a gnat in here. Change can happen if you have the patience and you stick with it.
It was an effective clap, though.
Yeah,
We
thank
are
you.
about to go to Q&A, but I do want to ask you one last question along those lines, because you're right. We're rarely going to be talking to a KKK Grand Wizard, or, to anyone who's on the extreme right or extreme left opposite
Yeah.
side of where we sit, somewhere closer to the middle. So if you are at the Thanksgiving table, right? Or let's say you don't celebrate Thanksgiving, but you're at a holiday gathering, and it is a relative, which is closer to home in so many ways. That can
Yeah.
make it more painful and more difficult, Celeste. So what is one example from the book of how to recalibrate your own personal dissonance from that moment so the conversation can be constructive?
Well, first of all, I want everyone to understand that statistically speaking, it's highly unlikely you're going to get into an argument. So take a breath. It's okay. You don't have to be afraid. You don't have to start getting nervous and anxious. Everyone there is mostly invested in keeping everything relatively calm. That's number one. Studies show that maybe only 8% of people actually have real arguments over the holiday table. So relax. Understand that you're in control. You have boundaries. And if it gets too much, you can say, this is too much for me. I've had enough. And you can either leave if it's that extreme, or you can say conversation over, and you can change the conversation. So with that in mind, the most effective way to make people rethink what they've said is to ask them questions. Now with microaggressions, for example, if your Uncle Phil, your racist Uncle Phil says, why do Black people make everything about race? I suggest you come up with something in advance that you might say that you don't have to think about. Something like, wait, what? What did you just say? I didn't hear you. What was that? And make them repeat it. Because sometimes that's enough. If it's not, and they do repeat it, you say, wow, I really do not see it that way. I very much disagree with you. Let me explain to you why. Quickly, like one sentence. You're not trying to win an argument. And then you're going to restore their humanity. This is the STAR system that's taught sometimes. It's stop, tell, assist, restore. So you stop them. Wait, what? You tell them, I disagree with that. You assist them by saying, I disagree with that because racism everywhere, and we have all this evidence showing that, things are harder for Black Americans. And then you restore them. You say, I know you're the kind of person that would never want to, be on the side of white supremacy. You're an inclusive person, you're a fair person, and that's why I'm surprised to hear you say that. And then you can keep the conversation going in that way. But you want them to stay engaged in a calm way. You don't want them to become defensive. So that's sort of a system that you can use.
I love that you got to STAR. I'm so glad that you brought that into the conversation because it's such a useful tool. Hello, Shane.
Hi. Thank you so much for answering a lot of the questions that I had, because I was going to ask, I don't come from a family that is very good about avoiding confrontation. We've had several upended tables, so I'm very... Oh, yeah.
Oh,
no.
wow. I want to come over there for a much more exciting holiday gathering than at my house.
And I wanted to ask personally, so I have a family member that I years ago have kind of written off after getting into repeated arguments. And I'm wondering if you have advice for how someone, maybe not specifically me, but maybe specifically me, can help to repair. This was specifically an argument, repeated arguments about race and racism, without pointing fingers. And I never actually called the family member racist. But I did say that they were supporting racism. So if there has been such a gigantic rift in a relationship how do you start to correct, or like, how do you fix it?
So the first thing is that you do not pretend like any of that stuff didn't happen. You're going to be honest about what's happening, and you're going to say, "Hey, listen, I haven't spoken to you this long time for a really long time. I was really upset by the last time that we spoke and all these other incidents before, but I would love to have a relationship with you. Are you willing to try?" And if they are, you can say a few things. Number one, you're going to say that it hurt you. You're not going to say this is disrespectful to black people. You're not going to say this is disrespectful to people of color, or that you're supporting white supremacy. You're going to say, when you say these things, it hurts my feelings. It upsets me. It's on me that this is my feelings that are being hurt. You want to make it as personal as possible. And then you say, so can we talk in a way where both of us are trying our best to not hurt one another? And that sort of lays the groundwork that if they say something that's offensive, you can say, you know what? That right there, that upsets me. Let me tell you why. You can use your star system. I'll assist you by explaining why that hurts me and upsets me. And I know we've had these arguments because you care. I can tell you care about this. And so, I know that you wouldn't want to continue hurting my feelings. Now, if this is somebody who continues to say things even though you've told them that it upsets you that they're saying them, then that tells you something about your relationship. Like if you've said this hurts me and they continue to do it, there's not that much that you can do at that point. You can continue to try to have these conversations, but you only have them up until the point at which they stubbornly refuse to stop saying the things that hurt you. And then you say, okay, that hurts me. You won't stop saying it. So let's change the subject. We're not going to agree on that. Let's talk about something else. Let's talk about tacos. Let's talk about what the best beer is. Let's talk about something else entirely. Now, this other part of it, let's talk about something else. It seems dismissive, but in fact, it's incredibly important. Because finding those places on which you have common ground, that's what creates those empathic bonds that make it possible for them to eventually start caring that they hurt your feelings, right? Like those creating and strengthening those empathic bonds, that is what changes people. So, again, I joke all the time about almost everyone can agree that dogs are better than people, right? I mean, come on. So, but that's super important, right? Finding those things on which you agree is a really important part of it. But be honest, we're not going to agree on this, so let's find something else we agree on.
I want to remind the audience that now is the time to ask these incredible questions. I was able to ask one of my questions that I've been waiting to ask an expert like you for incredible advice. Probably advice way like, thank you for answering my question is what I'm saying. And the audience watching, type up your questions now. I'm certain that they are on your mind. I know that you're watching, so I feel free to ask a question if you want it to not be personal. I can leave off your name as well.
Shane, was that helpful? Would you be able to do that, or is that not a viable working solution?
I think it is. I think that the last couple of times that we have seen each other have been in very public places, and our kind of breakdown was through, I think it was Facebook Messenger at the time. It might have even just been on someone's wall, like slowly devolving over the course of several hours. Yeah. But the last few times that we have seen each other have been like at a store, and has been awkward, but showing that there is still a relationship there. And like, this is one of the first people that kind of supported me when I came out. So like, it is an important relationship for me. And so I think that having the kind of space that we've had and the acknowledgement that we both, I think, want to have a relationship is the great starting point that we need. So
the starting point that Celeste is talking about.
Yeah.
Celeste, we have a question. Does this information apply to religious differences as well?
It does. Race is one of the most difficult conversations we can have, and so this book is specifically focused on that. But frankly, religious differences are not that far behind, as noted by, the fact that we even have to talk about people coming out at this point tells you a lot about differences, not just with religion, but with gender, with sexuality. And frankly, these principles will all basically stay the same. So the thing is that when a human being is criticized, we live in a verbal society. And what that means is that when you're attacked, it's not going to come in the form of a punch in the face. It's most likely to come in the form of a criticism. And social standing is the difference between life or death to a Homo sapiens. Like, it's serious for a human being. We, over the course of our 300,000 years and change, being part of a community and belonging and your social standing literally meant the difference between life and death. So we know, but by watching the brain and monitoring brain activity, that when you are criticized, your brain and body react in exactly the same way they do as if you were physically attacked. Your respiration will go up, your breath starts to get faster, your heartbeat increases, your muscles begin to tense because you are preparing yourself to fight or flee. And so essentially in all of these situations, religious, racial, whatever they are, all these situations in which someone thinks that they're casting judgment on you, or that you are criticizing your beliefs or your values in some way, yeah, you're going to run into these same issues, and the solutions are mostly the same.
Is there no situation, Celeste, in which, and I will say also about the question that we just received, the book, although it is very much about race, is also very much about conversation and about how to talk around really, really hard topics, race being the topic of this book, but you could apply it to any really hard topic. How do I deal with my relative who keeps berating my marriage choice or my choice of, adopting this child, even though I am single, or, all kinds of things you might choose to do in life. And you have this relative or this friend or this neighbor or this coworker that you have to deal with. And your choices are to not deal with it or to really have the hard conversation. And this book is so fantastic around, you got to thank you, Celeste, for your answer.
Thank you. You're welcome.
But Celeste, I want to also ask you about, and a lot of us in the last political cycle, and I'm sure many other people in other political cycles had this question of whether sometimes it's just not worth it.
Yeah.
Like, I am just not having that conversation with that person because I'm done with that relationship.
Let me tell you about.
Do we always have to have these conversations, Celeste?
No. But I will make you aware of this one super awesome sort of structure to keep in your mind. And I learned this from Dolly Chugh, who wrote the book, The Person You Mean to Be. She learned it because it's a marketing strategy. But she's a specialist in bias and unconscious implicit bias. And she describes it as the 60-20-20 rule. I mean, number one, there are people you're not going to be able to talk to. So essentially, you can divide any group of people into 60, 20, and 20. There's going to be the 20% who are just gung-ho. They are absolutely in support. They are with you. They're ready to take action to make change. There's the other 20% at the bottom who are stubborn. They're called the stuck 20. Because they will not move. Not only are they resistant to any change and to any idea that they may be wrong, but they may fight you and actively undermine your efforts. Those people there's no point in talking to, except the most important group is the 60 in the middle. They're known as the movable 60 because they could go either way. So if you're talking to one of the stuck 20, your audience isn't the stuck person. It's the person listening. It's the person in the middle that you never want to hear. Let them hear a microaggression go unnoted, with no pushback. That's your audience. And so, yes, there are absolutely people that there's no point in talking to. And frankly, if you're not emotionally in a state where you can have this conversation, I say don't have it. You will have so many more opportunities. But if the reason you're withholding that conversation is because that person's stuck, keep in mind who's watching.
That is excellent advice. Shane, I'm mindful of our clock. Is this my wonderful opportunity to promote the book again?
Yes.
I want to remind everybody that you can get your Celeste. It's like you two are too funny. It's like being on Wheel of Fortune.
Wait, you want to do what? You want to talk about the book?
Please get your copy. Speaking of Race at Left Bank Books, we're a great team. You can get it online or you can get it at the store. You can do it all. And I want to say thank you so much to Left Bank Books and to Celeste for thinking of me and Shane for introducing us both. And Celeste, most of all, to you for writing a brilliant book. It is thankfully time for this book, and it's going to make a big difference. So thank you for it.
Thank you, Jamie. Thanks for doing this. And Shane, thanks for having us both.
Thank you. And I want to thank the audience as well for coming out tonight for the event. We hope to see you again really soon, and thank you for being here. All right, have a good night, everyone.
Bye.